Okay, Chevra, we are going to start. We're starting Perek Yud Aleph, which is the end of the Maimer Vayichan. We learned previously in the Maimer that Atzilus is a mamutza between Orein Sof and the Oilemis. And as with any mamutza, a mamutza has to have two aspects to it. On the one hand, it's got to relate to what's above it. On the other hand, it has to relate to what's below it. In other words, Atzilus has to have the qualities of the Orein Sof before the Tzimtzum. It also has to have the qualities of the Oilemis after the Tzimtzum. And the explanation was that this actually refers to the keilim. The keilim of Atzilus are the ones that relate to the Oilemis Hamugbolim, the limited worlds that come below. In other words, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. And the keilim are bebechinas ein aroch to the Orein Sof. And he explained that even more than the ein aroch of Asiya to Atzilus is the ein aroch of Atzilus to the Orein Sof, and particularly mitzad the keilim. But then we asked the question, Haytochen, because the keilim of Atzilus are also Atzilus, and as we know, the inyan of Atzilus is all Elokus. As it says in Tanya Geras HaKodesh, Perik 20, Perik Chaf. In other words, that even the keilim of Bechinas Chad. And he said, yes, that's true. The keilim of Bechinas Chad mitzad the mahus of the inyan of the keilim. But nevertheless, he gave a moshel for it to explain why the keilim, even though they're bechinas chad, nevertheless they separated from the Orein Sof. They're bechinas nivdal. And he explained it as follows. He gave the moshel of a nitzotz and the fire from which it comes, a nitzotz being a spark, right? So there's a spark which flies off from the fire, and the etzem of the spark is nothing other than fire. Nevertheless, it's separated from the fire. It's not part of the fire anymore. It's a different mitzias. And so too, the inyan of the keilim. And he backed that up with an explanation of one of the origins of the inyan of the keilim. One of the explanations of the origin of the keilim is that the oiros are the or yashar and the or choizer are makim ze bazeh, right? They crash into each other, so to speak, and sparks fly off, and that's what makes the oisius reshimu. That is one of the explanations. He's going to give other explanations of oisius reshimu later on, but that's one of the explanations. And the main emphasis that he has over there is not that they're just the oisius reshimu, but they're bechinas nefila. They fell down from their madrega. In other words, they fell from a level of his achdus, where they were one with the Orein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and they had a nefila. They fell down to a lower madrega, so to speak. So in the nefila is that they became separated. Okay. We're now beginning Perek Yud Aleph. If anyone does not have a sefer in front of them, they can follow along on the sharing screen, and this is where we're about to begin. If anyone wants to get this up on their own screen or whatever, for whatever reason, it's chabadlibrary.org. You can just copy the URL over here and you'll find it. In any event, we're in Perek Yud Aleph, as you can see. So he said that kol zehu b'chinas keilim. The inyan of the keilim is that they have a shayches to olamis biyah, and they're ba'en aroch to the Orein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's as far as the keilim is concerned. Which are also called chad. Chayoy refers to the oirois. Garmoy refers to the keilim. Chayoy chad bahon. He and his oirois are chad in the oirois of Atzilus. Oirois of Atzilus are hem b'chinas giloy hahelem Orein Sof. They're not an inyan of yesh mi'ayin. They're an inyan of giloy hahelem. Not like the keilim. The keilim are called yesh mi'ayin because of b'chinas nefila, because they come from the inyan of helem. and therefore you don't see the makor of the keilim, which will explain shortly in greater detail. But in any event, the inyan of the oiros is the gilui hahelem. Now, gilui hahelem means that they're still connected to the oiros is still connected to the way they were before the tzimtzum, and we'll explain that shortly also. So, what's the gilui hahelem of the oiros of Atzilus? The oiros of Atzilus come from the kav, and the kav, as he's going to explain right now, is b'pchinas kiruv elo orein sof. Let's go for it, and we'll explain it as we go along. So, aval oiros the Atzilus, as when it comes to the oiros of Atzilus, haram b'pchinas gilui hahelem orein sof ha'matzil. That's where they come from. That's where the shorish is. Like the shorish is in the helem of orein sof, which is helem before the tzimtzum, and now the b'chinas gilui, it's a gilui hahelem. Now, what's mizgale was already there behelem, but only now the difference is now that it's mizgale. Shari hisavusan, these havus of these oirois is me'akav, right? The oirois come from the kav, as we know. After the tzimtzum, the kav was nimshach, the kav ha'oir. The kav is also called the chut, and we'll explain why shortly. The kav and the chut, it's one thing essentially, but just two different aspects of the kav. So his havus of the kav is from the orein sof. But in what way was it mizhava from the orein sof? It was mizhava from the orein sof, but bechinas kiruv. His avusan who bechinas kiruv. His havus of the oiris, it was in a way of kiruv. In other words, not in a way of richuk like the keilim, not in a way of nefila and richuk, which is shaykh to the keilim, but adarab in a way of kiruv. What does that mean in a way of kiruv? It means that the oiros are traceable to the orein sof lifnei hatzimtzum, and we'll explain why shortly. Shahare haor kashu v'davuk b'orein sof hamatzil. The or is still, the or of the kav is kashur and davuk, really two different inyonim, kashur and davuk, but here he doesn't really make a distinction between them. He just wants you to know that there are two different inyonim. There's kashur is mitzad the chitzoniyus hakav, which we'll talk about, and davuk is mitzad pnimius hakav, which we'll also talk about. And the kav is kashur and davuk in the orein sof hama'atzil, kshalheves hakashur b'gacheles, like a shalheves which is kashur b'gacheles. In other words, like a shalheves which is outside of the kol, you can see the shalheves, but the entire existence of the shalheves is the gacheles. No, the kav is the external, and the chut is actually the internal. We'll explain that shortly. The kav is external. Well, let's explain it now. Let me just explain what these two terminologies. There's two aspects in the kav. There's chitzoniyus hakav and pnimius hakav. The chitzoniyus hakav is moedeid medidois, right? The whole inyan of the kav is to bring oiros lefi erech, the keilim of the oilemis. In other words, you have oilemis atzilus b'riya tzira asiya, and the inyan of the kav is to bring oilemis that are madudu mugbal lefi erech oilemis. In other words, oil that will not overwhelm the keilim of those particular worlds. So therefore, you have an inyan in the kav that it's madud umugbal. It's limit. There's limitations in the kav, and those limitations actually come from the reshimu, because the kav goes through the reshimu, or the kav is affected by the tzimtzum, right? And therefore, there's an inyan of hagbola in the kav. The kav is a kav dak, as it says, right? A kav dak, a thin line, and it has dimensions. It has a top, it has a bottom, and it has two sides. Right, and therefore the kav is the inyan of moeded medidois. Masha enken the chut is as a chut. A chut means literally means a thread. What a thread does is it binds two pieces of material or two pieces of leather, whatever, together, and that's exactly the inyan of the chut. That's the pnimius hakav. The pnimius of the kav is mayached yichudim, whereas the external aspect of the kav is moeded medidois. The inyan medida v'hagbola. The pnimius of the kav is the inyan of meyached yichudim. It makes yichudim between the spheroids and particularly between the paratzufim, which we're going to talk about much later. But it brings about this in of achdus. So that's the pnimius hakav. In other words, the pnimius hakav is megala the achdus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The chitzoniyus hakav is megala the koach hagvul of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there's two aspects in the kav. Okay, but anyway, he says that the kav is kashur v'davuk ba'orein sof ha'ma'atzil. It's connected to the orein sof ha'ma'atzil, kashal heves kashur b'gacheles, like a flame is bound to a coal. Lochein haya bebechinas bli ma, and therefore the kav, sorry, not haya, hein bebechinas bli ma. Therefore the kav is bebechinas bli ma. In other words, the oiros that we're talking about that are nimshach from the kav are bebechinas bli ma, bli mahus. Bli mahus u'metzias, as he's going to explain. Shelo bebechinas mahus u'metzias. In other words, that whole inyan of the or is the inyan of bittul. The inyan of or is to magala the ma'or. Not to Megala itself, not to Megala Oris Mukbalim, but to Megala the Ma'or essentially, and that's primarily mitzad the pnimius hakav. But in any event, Olachein Hainu bechinas blima, the Oris of bechinas blima, Shlo bechinas Mahus Metzias Midos Koichos, because the Midos and Koichos, the Metzias Midos and Koichos is in the Indian of the keilim. Mash Einkan, the Indian of the Oir is the Indian of the Or Ein Sof. That's where it comes from. That's its shoirish. But nevertheless, he'll explain that the or is nevertheless only ha'ora. It's not mamish etzem ha'or. Okay, we'll explain. The kav is davek to the or in sof. And Eitz Chaim is speaking about the Indian of the tzimtzum. So it speaks about the tzimtzum, that silek is the or alat stadim. He removed the or ein sof that was mamale kol halal. Yeah, in the beginning it was or ein sof mamale kol halal, and he removed that or ein sof, and that was the tzimtzum harishon. He removed it with mali in the or he was with the or is mistalik. There's two beginners, and let's not get into it now. But in any event, the or that was nistalik became what is called the Iggul Hagadol. Right, the Iggul Hagadol, that's the or that surrounds the halal. Right, it's the or that surrounds the halal, the Iggul Hagadol. And the kav comes from the Iggul Hagadol. The kav is nogeya to the Iggul Hagadol at its top, at the top of the kav. The bottom of the kav reaches into the halal and doesn't come out the other side, because if it would just be two heads, and there would be no medida of a hagbola in the kav. It would return to its state of Ein Sof. In any event, that's the Indian of the kav. Kav nogeya v'davuk ba'Ein Sof Baruch Hu. The kav is nogeya on one side to the or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, which or the or that was nistalik, the or that's now called the Iggul Hagadol, the or, in other words, that would be bechinas makif around the halal. That's where the kav is attached to. So he explains further. Even though the kav is also affected by the tzimtzum, it's nimshach alidei tzimtzum, because the kav comes after the tzimtzum, and he's going to mention it later, but we might as well mention it now. What do you mean the kav is nimshach alidei tzimtzum? The reason I'll ask the question, he says as follows: why, if we just wanted to leave a kav dak, didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu simply take away all the rest of the or, let's say 95% of the or, and leave over the 5% or the 10% or whatever the percentage kav of the or, the kav is? Why don't you just remove the rest of the or and leave the kav the way it is? Like leave it, take away most of the cake and leave the kid with a slice, right? And why didn't he do it like that? Why did he masalik all of the or, whatever siluk means in this case, but why was he masalik all of the or and then mamshich a new or in the or of the kav? Why did it have to be like that? Okay, that's what it means, that the kav was nimshach al yedei hatzimtzum, and he's going to explain it further, so we don't need to get into it right now, why Tafka was like that. V'chein hakav mi or ein sof. I'm sorry, I went back on the same line. Nevertheless, it's still from the or ein sof lifnei hatzimtzum. Which or ein sof lifnei hatzimtzum? The or that was nistalik. It's roish. The rosh hakav is nogeya in the or of the Iggul Hagadol. The or shebebechinas makif around the chalal. Okay, that's called the Iggul Hagadol. So he continues, and even though the hamshach of the kav has to come after the dilug hatzimtum, in other words, the tzimtum has to precede the kav. There has to be a radical break. You can't just leave the or behind the way he wanted it to be marudum. There has to be that radical break of the tzimtum before the kav can be nimshach. And he gives a marshal for it. And has to come about by way of the jump. There's a quantum leap from before the tzimtum to after the tzimtum. Like the hair has to go through a tzimtum, in some people more than in others. The hair has to go through a tzimtum of the hefsek of the gugoilis. In other words, the skull is mafsik between the brain and the hair. Right? Now, what does that mean? It sounds like pretty weird. But the idea is as follows. What flows down the hair? What flows down the hair is oil, right? Some people have more oily hair, less oily hair, but nevertheless, down the hair follicle, oil flows. Where does that oil come from? Well, in a physical sense, it obviously comes from glands and so on and so forth. But in a spiritual sense, the union of the chutim of the hair, the sarois, is that they mamshich from the or of chokhmah, which is called shemen, right? Shemen, oil, olive oil in particular, is the primary source of light in Torah, right? The menorah was lit with shemen zayis. So the same thing, shemen is what flows down the hair, and that shemen comes from chokhmah, and that's in a physical sense it's oil, but in a spiritual sense it's in of oil. Okay, so that's the sarois. Someone has dry hair, they have less chokhmah. Lav davka. It just might mean that your chokhmah stays where it's supposed to. Okay. The hole is a tube, hollow inside. Yes, the hair is. Yes, the hair is a tube. That's right. Let's try and get questions sent to everybody rather than just privately to me, because otherwise no one else knows what they're talking about. So, all right. So again, commercial hasaras of the hefsek goylis. Mikol makoim. Nevertheless, even though there's a hefsek, hasaras yonkim ha'moyach. The saros, the hair is yonkim ha'moyach. It is a yanika. It gets its energy from the moyach. In other words, the oil that flows down the hair comes from the moyach. Even in a physical sense, the amount of oil that comes out through the hair is dependent upon things that are controlled by certain parts of the brain. In other words, the various bodily functions are regulated by hormones in the brain and so on and so forth. Hormones that are produced by the various brain functions, pituitary glands, this, that, and the other. I didn't do a study of it physically, but that's the way it is, I feel, in a physical sense. So that's the way it is in a spiritual sense, because Baruchnius is the plan for Gashmius. Gashmius is al derech the Ruchnius. Okay, so let's continue. And similarly, as far as the Kav is concerned, Bechinas Chuta Yakira Kadisha, this holy thread, this holy chut, which is the Kav, the Ikri Mazel, which is called a Mazel. Why is it called a Mazel? Because Mazel is from the word nozel, to flow. It's the flow from the brain down through the hair follicle. Similarly, the Kav is called a Mazel because it's a flow from the Orein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum into the kav. So again, that's why it's called Chuta Yakira Kadisha, the holy thread, the Ikri Mazel. It's called Mazel because it's a flow. It's noisel. Noisel min Lavanoin, as it says. It's noisel from Lavanoin. Lavanoin is the livnunis of the skull, which is the moshel for the Iggul Hagadol, just like the skull surrounds the brain, so too the Iggul Hagadol surrounds essentially surrounds the halal, and the brain is the koichas pnimius, whereas the Iggul Hagadol is the koichas makifim. Similarly with a human being, and that's why the hairs come out of the skull. Of course, when one starts to lose one's hair, that's a sign of chokhmah. Because there is less being nimshach, it's more developing inside. Anyway, let's not get into into highly charged political subjects. Let's just continue. Okay, so it's called Ikri Mazel. Haru beginners the veikus be'orein sof baruch hu. The kav is dovek in the orein sof baruch hu, as we said before. Sham shochzoi hu beginners gilui. The hamshach of the kav is gilu. It's a gilu of or. That's the whole inyan of the kav is to bring about gilu. And what kind of gilu is it? What was behelem, the or that was ne'elam al yedei ha'tzimtzum, which became the Iggul Hagadol, the or that was nistalik and ne'elam. That is the or which the kav is mamshich from. And that's what he explains in Perek Yud Ches. Now the rest of the Perek is basically one long Haggadah, so you'll just we might as well just ignore the Haggadah here and just treat it as if the actual text itself. Yuvan, from what we explained before, it's understood that there's an advantage of the keilim over the oires. We'll explain why. Because the or itself is a ha'ora. Masha'enkan, the keilim are not ha'ora. The keilim are even though the keilim are yesh mi'ayin and ba'en aroch to their source, nevertheless, they weren't actually affected by the tzimtzum, as he will explain. He's going to explain that shortly. So again, there's a mila, a yisron mila, but keilim ala oires. And there's one thing that does not seem to be explained, certainly not adequately, in other Sfarim outside of Chabad Hasidus. In other words, amongst other Hasidim, other Hasidic Sfarim, but derech klal, they might mention it here and there, but they certainly don't explain it. But derech klal, the ikar she'ifa, the ikar longing is for the oiros, and not so much for the keilim. And therefore, you see that the emphasis there is more on dveikus rather than maisa. And certainly the Rebbe's emphasis, and in fact coming from all the way from the Alter Rebbe, is the inyan of Maisa because it has to do with the keilim. And this is because the shorish of the keilim is actually higher than the shorish of the oir, as we'll see shortly. So again, Yisrael Ma'al Keilim al oir is the shorish of keilim hein ma reshimu. The keilim come from the reshimu. What's the reshimu? The reshimu is the koach hagvul in the or ein sof before the tzimtzum. It's the koach hagvul. Once the or ein sof, the koach hagilui, has been removed by way of the tzimtzum, that's called the koach hagilui. Then the koach habligvul, the koach hagilui. Then the koach hagvul starts to become recognized, so to speak. The koach hagvul. So there's a koach hagvul and koach habligvul. Both of them are koachas of or ein sof in an equally way. The koach hagvul, and in the koach hagvul itself, there's actually two inyonim. There's one of the inyonim is koach of lola ha'ir klal, which is the inyan of the tzimtzum, and then the koach laha'ir b'midu gvul, right? Laha'ir b'midu gvul is how the kav is nimshach into the world affected by the reshimu, because that koach gvul then limits the kav. All right, let's explain it as we go along. The shorish keilim heima reshimu, shezehu roishem. What's the reshimu? The reshimu is what's left from the or ein sof before the tzimtzum. It's a certain aspect of the or ein sof, the koach hagvul in the or ein sof, are also called the esesfiris agnuzois, as we'll mention shortly. The esesfiris agnuzois and the koach hagvul are the same thing, and that's what's left after the stalkus of the or with the tzimtzum. Okay, So again, the shorish keilim amer reshimu is the shizeu reshimu me'ayin sof shelifnei hatzimtum. I might have said Miha or Ein Sof. It's Miha Ein Sof because the Koach HaGvul is the Koach Ein Sof. It's not a Koach of the Or Ein Sof. Or Ein Sof is the Gilui. Koach Ein Sof is the end of Koach HaGvul. כמו שכתוב במאמר, the oasis reshimu lo naga behem hatzimtzum klal. They were not affected by the tzimtzum. Lo naga behem ba'oasis hatzimtzum. Now, there's a big machlokas about this actually in Chabad itself. There was one of the brothers of the Rebbe Maharash. The Rebbe Maharash is the one that speaks most about this inyan of the reshimu in a series of Mamorim in Tafresh Mem, Yoinasi B'Chag V'Yasela, and various others. Tafresh Mem, he speaks about this inyan of the reshimu, and there was a big argument between him and his brothers. One of them, his name was Shlomo Zalman or Shnei Zalman. I think Shlomo Zalman Kapust, the Kapuster Rebbe. That eventually, they sort of divided off from Chabad. Chabad followed the Rebbe Maharash, and there were Kapuster Hasidim that followed the Shlomo Zalman, Shnei Zalman. I think Shlomo Zalman of Kapust, and he argued that the oasis of reshimu naga b'hem hatzimtzum. The tzimtzum did affect the oasis of reshimu, and he tries to bring a proof from the Sefer Emek HaMelech. So Rebbe Maharash, and based on he brings also quotes from the writings of the Tzemach Tzedek as well. The Rebbe Maharash proves that the way he understood what the Emek HaMelech was talking about was incorrect. The Emek HaMelech is the one that spoke about the reshimu. Nobody else really speaks about the reshimu. The Emek HaMelech spoke about it most, and then there's the Rabbi Yisrael Sarug, who was the teacher of the Ayin Beis, who was a Talmid of the Arizal, but those are the only ones that really speak about the inyan of the reshimu. But in any event, as far as the oasis of reshimu are concerned, the Rebbe Maharash explains why Lo naga b'hem hatzimtzum. What does it mean, Lo naga b'hem hatzimtzum? It means that the tzimtzum didn't actually affect the koyach of the oasis. The koyach of the oasis, the way they were before the tzimtzum, are exactly the way they are after the tzimtzum. That koyach was not affected at all. The only thing that was removed from the oasis was some of the oil. And not even all of the oil, because otherwise it wouldn't be a reshimu. And that was what, if you want to see more about this, you can have a look in Mishnah's Chabad, the sefer that I wrote quite a few years ago already. There's a whole section on the reshimu and Nagabah Boya Tzimtzum and so on and so forth. You can have a look there. This is Shlomo Zalman of Kapust, was the Tzemach Tzedek's grandson, the Kapust, that's right. Yes. Okay, so in any event, כמו שכתוב במאמר, the oasis of reshimu lo naga b'hem hatzimtzum. He goes according to the shita of his father, the Rebbe Maharash, the Rebbe Rashab does, and so as far as we're concerned, lo naga b'hem hatzimtzum. They weren't affected by the tzimtzum in any way. In other words, they have exactly the same koyach as they had before the tzimtzum. V'ime yoy sheyesh loyma she'al yedei shenis aleim gilo ha'or min ha'oisius. Before, the oil was misgala holiday oasis, to the extent that the oasis themselves were completely overcome by the oil. You didn't see the hagbola of the oil holiday oasis before the tzimtzum, right? And then the oil was removed, but not the oasis themselves. So he says, even though you could say, and he sort of hat tip to his uncle over here, to his father's brother, the Kapus there. But even though there's an argument that you could say shenis alen gilo ha'or min ha'oisius, but only gilo ha'or, but not helam ha'or. Nevertheless, al yedei zeh nasu b'chinas metzius, and that's how they became metzius, the metzius of oisius, because shenis alem hagilu min ha'or min ha'oisius. Nevertheless, lo naga b'hem hatzimtzum. Okay. שזהו ההפרש בין oasis reshimu כמו שהן לפני הצמצום וכמו שהן לאחר הצמצום. The difference between the oasis before the tzimtzum and after the tzimtzum is that the or which was mizgala al yadei oasis was now removed by the tzimtzum. כמו שכתוב במקום אחר, and he'll explain this later on in in Ayin Beis as well. But without getting into the whole argument, he just says, the or was only nis alim. It wasn't that the oasis themselves were affected by the tzimtzum. It was only that the oir was misalim only that tzimtzum. Again, mikol makam harizeh rak his almus haor shelo naga hatzimtzum ba'oisius. The tzimtzum didn't affect the oasis themselves. In other words, the shurish of the keilim was not affected by the tzimtzum. Rak shnis alim haor. Only the oir was removed and was effective. Nizgalu ha'oisius. And that's how the oasis came to be begilui. Oil days there. So the oasis came to be bebechinas gilu and bebechinas metzius, bebechinas metzius chulu. As he explains elsewhere. Actually, as the Rebbe Maharash explains elsewhere. In any event, that is as far as the oasis are concerned. Va'oirois shenimshachim al de'akav. Hagam, the shorish, even though the shorish, as we said before, of the kav is in the orein sof, that was nistalik all of that tzimtzum. The shorish of the kav is in the Iggul Hagadol, as he says, me orein sof shilifnei tzimtzum. When it means lifnei tzimtzum, it doesn't mean time-wise. It means it's above the inyan of the tzimtzum because it's above. The Iggul Hagadol surrounds it, makif the halal, the empty void in between, and therefore it is lifnei hatzimtzum, not temporarily but spatially, so to speak. That's only after the or was already nisalem b'chazav v'nimshach. The or had to first be misalem, then it was drawn back down again, and that became the kav. So the kav is attached to this or, but only after the or was removed via the tzimtzum. And so too is understood from Eitz Chaim, according to what the Eitz Chaim asked the question over there, the Arizal asked the question himself in Eitz Chaim, why didn't the kav simply remain? In other words, as we said before, if you wanted 5% or 10% of the or to remain, just take away the other 90% and you'll have 10% left, you'll have the kav. So why didn't it simply remain behind? Since the intention was to bring it back down again, you could have just, saved yourself all the bother by not removing all the oil and then bringing some of it back, by just removing the percentage of the oil that you wanted removed and leaving behind the percentage that you wanted to remain behind. So why didn't he do it like that? The T-rates, that's the Arizal's teretz. Keilim, it was only possible for the keilim to come into existence if the or was nisalim. Why? Because had the or remained behind, the or would have still flooded the oasis reshimu, and the oasis reshimu would have not come into gilui, and therefore we wouldn't have had the keilim, because the oasis reshimu are the shorish of the keilim. Again, the oasis reshimu are the various aspects of koach hagvul. The koach hagvul shelifnei hatzimtzum. Okay. Again, שלא היה אפשר להיות יסבס הכלים כאשר נסעלם האור לגמרי, ואחר כך חזר והמשיך את האור וכנס משקל ומידה. במידה ומשקל. The or is once again nimshach in a way of mida and mishkal, in a way of limitation. It's brought in a limited yes, the reshimu, so the question was asked here, isn't the reshimu something left behind? So the question is, what really was left behind? Again, there's a whole discussion whether there was any or left in the oisius, or there was just the oisius left. And that's a whole discussion, but the conclusion of the discussion is there was also or left in the oisius, but or that would be able to be nimshach into, in other words, we'll see later that there's actually two aspects of the oisius reshimu. There's the etzem nukudas reshimu, and then there's the hispashtus of the oisius of the reshimu. So the etzem nukuda and the hispashtus. We'll get to it later, so I don't want to sort of discuss it too much now. We'll get to it soon. Okay. Okay, so from this we understand that the kav was chazer v'heir, as it says in Eitz Chaim, and that was chazer v'heir bebechinas mida umishkal. Right, the or came into a measured and weighed kaviochol gilui. Harimuvan, the or akav shechazer v'himshich haor enso baruch hu or shenitzamtzem nistalek. This is the or that was itself nistamtem and nistalik. In other words, again, as we said before, the or that was taken out of the halal became the Iggul Hagadol that surrounds the halal. That was the or. That's the origin of the kav. Okay, so we have a question because there's a note in Oitzres Chaim. Oitzres Chaim is actually let's call it it's the latest version of Eitz Chaim that the Arizal wrote. The Arizal wrote Kama Madurois, a number of different editions. He was trying to explain the basic outline of the Arizal's Kabbalah, and there were a number of different Mahaduros, a number of different versions of it. And the one's called Sharak Domus now, and another one's called Oitzes Chaim. And the one that's called Eitz Chaim was actually a compilation of all the versions put together. So therefore, you'll have a Madura Kama, Madura Tinyana, and so on and so forth. And you have differences between various chapters. Sometimes you'll find one chapter says it as follows in the Madura Kama, and then a different in the Madura Tinyana, and then Madura Basra, and you have different versions. The Eitz Chaim itself was not put together in the format that it is by Rabbi Chaim Vital. It was put together by Rabbi Meir Poppers, or Poppers in English. They call him usually Popperish, but Poppers, that was his name. So he was the one that put Eitz Chaim together. But the Oitzes Chaim was really the most how shall we say, refined and sifted and sorted version of the Kabbalah of the Arizal that Rabbi Chaim Vital himself did. So we have a note in the Oitzes Chaim, and the Oitzes Chaim seems to contradict what we just said. So he says over here like this: Oitzes Chaim, and a note there in Oitzes Chaim, the Adam HaYashar. Adam HaYashar means the Kav, which is the Kav Yashar. It's called Adam HaYashar because all of the Hamshochas post Tzimtzum are called Adam, the Adam Elyon. They have a reflection of the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. So therefore we have Adam HaYashar, and Adam Kadmoin, and Adam Debria, which is actually Olam HaAtzilus, and Adam the Yetzira is Olam Izbiyah, and so on. In any event, so there's a Hagor in Oitzes Chaim, the Adam HaYashar, that's the Kav, whom Madrega Shalo Higia Bo HaTzimtzum. He says over there that the Kav is a Madrega that the Tzimtzum didn't affect. And we just said the whole difference between the Tzimtzum and the reshimu, between the reshimu and the Kav, is that the reshimu lo noga b'ha Tzimtzum, and the Kav yen noga b'ha Tzimtzum. Because the Kav is dafka a thing that's post Tzimtzum. Masha Enk and the reshimu was something that was nizgala all the tzimtzum, but wasn't noga b'ha tzimtzum. The tzimtzum didn't actually affect it per se. So how do we have this note in Oitzes Chaim that seems to be contradictory? Because it says he madrega shelo yigi b'ha tzimtzum. So he answers that and he says yesh lo yimar zehu chinas pnimius hakav, because the pnimius hakav was not affected in the same way the chitzoniyus hakav was affected. Again, the inyan of pnimius hakav is meyached yichudim. The chitzoniyus hakav is moeded medidois. So the chitzoniyus hakav is shaykh to oilemes. The pnimius hakav is shaykh to the Or Ein Sof, which is the thing that's meyached everything together. Okay. As we know, that the achdus of something, when there's various disparate things that are brought together, like they explain, echad b'shamayim va'aretz. So you have shamayim, you have aretz, and they're two different things. And when they're brought together, then you have ha'oir ha'oila al kulana. In other words, the transcendent or that now comes from the combination of two different things, and that is a higher madrega. That is the inyan of the inyan of Achdus, the inyan of Meyachid Yichudim, the inyan of pnimius. Okay, let's continue. Why? Because the oiros were affected by the tzimtzum. The keilim were not affected by the tzimtzum. Wolfson quotes me in a footnote. That's interesting. Elliot Wolfson. Interesting. All right. Elliot Wolfson is a professor at New York University. He's a bit of a... All right, I won't say anything. Maybe watch these videos. He's a very bright guy, but he has to tends to take a little bit of a dim view of, it seems to me, somewhat of a dim view of Yiddishkeit. All right, let's leave it at that. That's what it seems to me. I don't think he's a frum person. Maybe he is. I don't know. In any event, he takes an academic approach to things. And so too we can understand from the nitzots that's separated from the shalhevet, from the flame. What do we say about the nitzots? It's taka separated from the flame. The oises reshimu are the shurish hagvul, the shurish hagvul. Nevertheless, the be'etzim, they're the same oir as the oir of the shalhevet. The nitzots is also a spark of oir. It's not anything else. It's the same material, it's the same muhus. I'm sorry. Period. Right? Again. The spark is the etzem of the flame itself. Only it's separated from it, but it's still the same mahus. Vashalheves, whereas the shalheves, the flame, einu etzem hagacheles, is not the gacheles itself. It's the pu'ul of the gacheles. It's the effect of the gacheles. It's the action of the flame and the coal are connected, but they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. Mashenkin, the spark and the gacheles are the same thing. Just one's much smaller. That's all. Okay. And that's why the oiros come down to be clothed in the keilim. Let's take it as a sort of a transactional discussion, right? There's a transaction over here. The oiros would say to the keilim, so what's in it for me? You know, there you are, you lowly keilim. Like, why on earth would I want to come down and be closed within these keilim? What's the benefit to me? What do I get out of it? I can understand what you get out of it. You get plenty. You get ore in your keilim, which was empty before, right? Your keilim chashuchin, they were dark keilim, so to speak. They had no ore in them, and you're going to get a tremendous advantage. But what's in it for me? So the keilim will tell him, well, my shoyrish is higher than your shoyrish, right? Kavioch. Right, that's Kavioch, the discussion that will go on. So again, was there a time Eretz Yordim Lislavish by Keilim who machmas Sherish Keilim Shalamang Eretz since the Sherish of the Keilim is actually higher than the Oiros are definitely getting something out of it. By being Malubish in the Keilim, the Oiros is having an aliyah because the Sherish of the Keilim is high, even though that Sherish is Behelim. But nevertheless, and that's why it's Behelim, because it's higher. Okay. Okay, be'emes, bittul keilim, magia l'maylim, bittul ha'oiros. Why? Because the shorish, the keilim is higher, but nevertheless, the keilim, so to speak, are masking kaviochel to descend down below, to be apparently cut off from, not mamish literally, but begiloi, they're not attached to their shorish anymore, and therefore they seem to be separated. And therefore, the bittul in the keilim is higher than the bittul in the oiros because the oiros are connected. In other words, You could say it like this: a shaliach in New York is not quite the same as a shaliach when he's in I don't know, Kazakhstan. Talk about a topic, or Alaska or something like that, right? They're very far away from the shorish. Nevertheless, the bittul of a shaliach to go that far out and so on and so forth must be, in some sense, greater than those who stayed in Crown Heights in the Sir Habasar, so to speak, in the flesh parts of Kavio. No, actually, I shouldn't say it like that. That's not right. Where they stay closer to the oil, right? That's the way to put it. They stay closer to the oil of closer to the Rebbe's oil, begilui. But the keilim that went out further, shluchim that went out to Mekomis Hanidachim, they in many ways had a much greater closeness with the Rebbe than those that were right next door. Okay, so same kind of inyan. Shezeh inyan hakdom is nasa lenishma. This is the gadlus of the keilim, or the bittul of the keilim, legabe the bittul of the oiros, is the bittul of nase legabe nishma. Nishma is already an inyan of oir. Mashenke nase is bittul, that's an inyan kabbalah soul. Right? We're not doing it because we understand it. We're doing it because we're told to do it. Okay. The nishma comes afterwards. The nase who bittul mitzvah keilim. That's that inyan of, and don't forget, we're talking. This is still a Shavuos Maimer, a Matan Torah Maimer, and so we're talking about the inyan of nase benishma, what the Yidden said before Kabbalah Torah. The nase who bittul mitzvah keilim. Which is a Purim Maimer. So Kibbal Yehudim is also al derech the inyan of Matan Torah. Then Kimu Mashe Kiblu Kvar. What they received at Matan Torah, the Kiyum was on Purim when there was no Gilui of oil. Adura was a time of Golus, it was a time of Shema, of Gzeres, and so on and so forth. Okay, in any event, that's explained there in that Maimer Torah. We could say, derech agav, I don't know if it's agav mamish, but we could say that this is also the advantage of iskafia over izhapcha. Izhapcha is when the fight is all over. You've transformed the enemy into a friend, right? But in the middle of the battle, that's already a much more consequential situation, right? When the battle is ongoing, the inyan of iskafia. So there's the mile of iskafia over izhapcha. And that's actually one of the fundamental differences between, you could say, between Chabad Hasidim and other Hasidim, because very often the inyan of izhapcha is actually achieved by the Rebbe and not by the Chassid himself. In other words, the iskafia doesn't lead to izhapcha as far as he's concerned. The izhapcha comes from milamayla. It's a gift from lamayla, from the Rebbe to the Chassid. Masha'en but they're clone in Chabad, it doesn't work like that. The iskafia maybe izhapcha. It's the person's own iskafia that brings the transformation about. Iskafia, self-subjugation, right? Iskafia, masha'en izhapcha, self-transformation. Okay, so malis iskafia al gabe al izhapcha. The ika inyan iskafia huba ha-keilim dafka. The main inyan of iskafia is the keilim, and therefore there's a mile to iskafia always izhapcha. Dafka. The zeu magir l'malam izhapcha. It's more, when we say it reaches to a higher source, meaning it gives HaKadosh Baruch Hu more nachas than izhapcha. Even though izhapcha is the final goal, but the struggle along the way is the ikka point, which might not be of much comfort, but that's the reality. So see over there, that whole union of iskafia and sapcha. Viyichon Yisrael neged ahar. This is the explanation of the posuk, that is the Divrei Maschil of this Maimah that starts off this Maimah. It says Viyichon Yisrael neged ahar. The question is asked in the Meforshim, why does it not say Vayachanu? Why Vayichan? Vayichan in the singular. It should say Vayachanu in the plural. Vayachanu Yisrael neged Har. Why Vayichan? This is to tell us something, says Rashi. What does it tell us? Kulam ki ish echad v'lev echad. Because we all became one at that point in time. We were amalgamated into one single entity. And that's why it says Vayichan in the singular. And he explains further. The inyan is chalkus, that when you're talking about all different entities within Bnei Israel, there's the Ayin Beis Shvatim, and then there's the tzaddikim, beinonim, and so on, and all these different levels within Bnei Israel. That's called his chalkus. The inyan is chalkus, masha ein deosei and shavois, and what makes one yid different from another. Because their opinions are different, just like it says, "Kamosha and partzufehem shavois and deoseim shavois." Just like people's faces are not identical one to the other, so too their opinions are not identical one to another, as we know. And why is that? Harizeh mitzad keilim. The differences between people is because the differences of the mizuk keilim, the different mizug, a different mixture of chesed, gvura, tiferes, and so on and so forth in each person. And that's mitzad the keilim, not mitzad the oiros. The hari mitzad neha nefasho is kula matimois haima. As far as the neshamas are concerned, all the neshamas come from the same shoirish. They all come va'avechad lukulana. The Alter Rebbe actually quotes in Tanya where it says this inyan in Perek Lamed Beis in Tanya, kulam matimois ve'avechad lukulana. All of them are matimois. They to'em one another. They're all of one cloth. Different pieces of one cloth, so they all form like a single puzzle. And when you put all the pieces together, that's matimois, right? Another explanation, matimois, the Zohar says that the inyan of matimois is kulam misarvan da b'da. They intermix one amongst the other. Vizdamkan da b'da, and they cleave to one another. That's what makes them one piece, so to speak. The Alter Rebbe puts it in terms of his kalulus, right? His kalulus in Likutei Torah, he says that the inyan of kulam matimois is that kulam toamois. They match one another in an ofen of his kalulus. What is his kalulus? His kalulus is that what's chaser in you is found in me. What's found in me, what's chaser in me is found in you, and therefore, these colors, when we come together, we all make one single harmonious picture. That's called kulam matimois. Elsewhere, it also says kulam pnimius. All of them are pure, perfect. Yoinasi tamasi is the way it's put in Shira Shirim. Tamasi to oimasi. It's like twins. Matimois is from Loshen to oimois. That's actually the Loshen kula matimois is from Shira Shirim. Perek Hey, I think, in Shira Shirim. And just like the oiros are oiros pshutim, Ayin Beis is chalkus. Certainly oiros on a very high level are oiros pshutim, and they don't have any division between them. It's only the keilim that make the division between them later on. Although there is in the chitzoniyus or there is an in of tzur, as we've spoken about before, according to Shittas Arizal. But the pnimius or is according to the Ramak that there's no tzura in the pnimius or. Okay, it's all the same or. That's the way it is in the shomas as they are in their etzem. Shemat imo is haima. They toim one to another. They twins. All the shomas are twins to one another, so to speak. And the only division between them is mitzad keilim, the different mizug, the different types, etc. And when it says by Matan Torah, Vayichon Yisrael Kulam Keish Echad, that's the in of bittul keilim, as we said before, that the bittul keilim is greater than the bittul ha'oris. And this is also like B'his Asef Rosh Am Yachad Shifta Yisrael, B'his Asef Rosh Am. When all of the Rosh Am get together, then it's Yachad. Everybody is Yachad. It's one thing. Shifta Yisrael. All the different Shvatim, all the different Madregas, all become one Inyan. Yachad. The Kyle Rosh Hashanah, that refers to the time of Rosh Hashanah. All become one thing. That's again mitzad bittul keilim or mitzad ha'oris. As we said before, that the bittul keilim is greater than the bittul ha'or. Excuse me. That also explains what the whole Inyan, the bittul of Rosh Hashanah, is a bittul of Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim. Shu Inyan bittul keilim dafka. Who is Achtus? So this Achtus on Rosh Hashanah is this Achtus of bittul keilim, and therefore an Inyan of Achtus altogether. And the same thing is true when it comes to Matan Torah, and perhaps by Matan Torah even more so. Because if we're talking about mitzvah the Inyan of Brias Oilamis, so it's true that Bnei Yisrael is echad, but since the Oilamis are b'his chalkus, the various worlds and the madregas in the world, there is his chalkus, there are divisions, there are different madregas. So Mela, there is a percent Inyan of his chalkus even in the Achtus of Bnei Yisrael in Rosh Hashanah, because the Inyan of creation, Ma'ashayin Kain, the time of Matan Torah, that's mamish the Inyan of Achtus Hashem, that was Miskale, and therefore there's mamish an Inyan of Achtus on Shavuos, Matan Torah. Kmo kain b'Matan Torah hayam bittul keilim ad shenasu ki ish echad, until they become one person. That's why it says Vayichon in the singular. And that was the proper preparation, the full preparation, a great preparation for Matan Torah, Achdus. In order to be Mamshich or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, where there is no Inyan of his Chalkus Chas v'Sholem, that could only come about through the Inyan of bittul and that Ish Echad. Shezeh Inyan HaTorah. That's what the Torah is all about. The Gilu of Amshoches, the Amshoch of Atzmus or Ein Sof. The Matan Torah Haya Begilu Mamish, and that Inyan was Begilu Vayarad Avaya Al Har Sinai, not one of the Shemois. Lefi Ma'asai Ani Ekra. All the Shemois are, as we learned earlier, when the Shemois are shaykh to the keilim, yes, to the or of the keilim, and so on and so forth. But since we're talking about the bittul of the keilim, we're talking about the Inyan of Shem Havaya, right? The Matan Torah Haya Begilu Mamish, the Inyan of Atzmus Ein Sof. By Yorat Havaya al Har Sinai. The Amshoch Hazu who all the bittul keilim dafka, as we just said. V'zeu vayichon sham Yisrael kulam keish echad, and therefore the pasuk says vayichon sham Yisrael, they camped as one person. Vayichon in the singular. Keish echad, or they are bittul shalahem. This was necessary at the time of Matan Torah, in order to bring down Torah from Atzmus. That was required. Okay, Kitzur, and this is the end of this mimer. As we said before, the oises bekiruv, they're attached to their shoresh, to their root. In other words, the kav is attached to the Orein Sof that was nistalik all of their tzimtzum, which again is the Indian of the Iggul Hagadol. Ha'oiris ha'isavus me'akav b'chinas kiruv to the Iggul Hagadol. V'akav nogea v'davuk b'Orein Sof, and the kav is nogea and davuk to the Orein Sof. Which Orein Sof? The Orein Sof that was removed from the Chalal. Yesh Yisro in Ma'ala b'Keilim, but there's an advantage therefore in the Keilim. The oises are reshimu lo nagabayin tzimtzum. They weren't affected by the tzimtzum. Ma'ashayin Kain hakav, but the kav was affected by the tzimtzum. Who or shenistalik. The kav comes from the or that was removed from the chalal. That's the shortage of the kav, as we just said. L'chein bittul keilim magia lamayla yoysa, and therefore the keilim, the bittul of the keilim is a higher madrega than the bittul of the oir. And now we understand why it says Vayichan in the singular. Because it's the inyan of Achdus, the inyan of bittul, and the shorish of the keilim, the bittul, the shorish of keilim is even lamala mi shorish ha'or. All right, that ends that mimer. Before we go into questions, just be aware that next week and probably the week after, I will not be giving a shiur, and we'll probably start sometime around Rosh Chodesh Elul or Shabbos Mevarchim, Mevarchim Elul. We'll start the next mimer, Be'ezus Hashem. But I will send out a WhatsApp, and you can take it from there. All right, any questions, Rabbi Isai? We'll give it a tie. All right. Gmail. Yep, I got it. Okay. Still New Jersey. Your New Jersey number. All right. Okay, gents. And all right, we'll leave it at that. It'll be posted on YouTube if anyone wants to listen again or share it with somebody. It'll be posted on YouTube under the Chassidus Decoded channel. Chassidus Decoded has all the Maimorim recorded here. Okay.